Right now, something massive is taking shape beneath China's mountains. Workers are digging huge hidden chambers into solid rock, not for weapons, not for people, but for oil. And when this underground network is finished, it will become the largest oil storage system ever built by a single nation. To put that into perspective, the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the largest emergency oil stockpile in the world today, can store about 400 million barrels. China is aiming for well over 1 billion barrels, and some long-term plans point toward nearly 2 billion. That is not a backup tank. That is a national energy shield. So why is China burying oceans of oil underground instead of storing it in giant tanks like everyone else? And once you see how fast China is building this system and how much oil is already flowing into it, the real question becomes, what does China know about the future of energy that the rest of the world is still arguing about? To understand why China is putting so much effort into these underground oil storage, you first need to look at how much oil the country actually uses and where that oil comes from. China is the world's largest oil importer. Every single day, it brings in more than 10 million barrels from overseas. That oil runs trucks, ships, airplanes, construction equipment, factories, and large parts of the power system. Even with rapid growth in electric vehicles and renewable energy, oil still sits at the center of China's transport and industrial economy. But here's the problem. China produces only a small portion of the oil it burns. About 3/4 of its supply comes from abroad. That means the economy depends on a constant flow of tankers crossing oceans, passing through narrow sea lanes and reaching Chinese ports without interruption. Most of those tankers pass through one critical bottleneck, the Strait of Malacca. This narrow stretch of water between Malaysia and Indonesia handles a huge share of global shipping, including a large portion of China's oil imports. If something blocks that route, ships must take much longer paths, adding cost, delays, and risk. In a serious crisis, that route could become unusable altogether. Chinese planners have worried about this exposure for decades. They even have a phrase for it inside policy circles, the Malacca dilemma. It describes the fear that hostile forces, conflict, or even accidents could choke off energy supplies and place the economy under pressure within weeks. And this is not just a theoretical concern. In recent years, sanctions, wars, and supply chain breakdowns have shown how quickly energy markets can change. When Russia invaded Ukraine, oil and gas flows across Europe shifted almost overnight. Prices jumped, shipping routes changed, long-term contracts suddenly lost reliability. For China, that moment sent a clear message. Access to oil cannot depend only on global markets working smoothly. The country needs large reserves inside its own borders, ready to release whenever imports slow down or prices spike. That is the strategic problem China is trying to solve. But instead of building only coastal tank farms, China chose a very different path, one that involves drilling deep into rock and turning entire hillsides into hidden energy vaults. And that brings us to the system itself, how big it is, how fast it is growing, and why it already surpasses anything built before. China did not start building oil reserves recently. The first phase of its National Strategic Petroleum Reserve began in the early 2000s, after price shocks and supply risks pushed energy security higher on the policy agenda. At that time, the goal was simple: build enough storage to survive short-term disruptions. But what China is building now is on a completely different level. Today, China already holds several hundred million barrels of oil in government-controlled reserves. On top of that, state-owned oil companies maintain large commercial stockpiles that can be redirected during emergencies. Combined, these systems already place China among the largest oil holders in the world, and they are still expanding. Between 2025 and 2026, state energy firms are scheduled to complete more than a dozen new underground storage bases. Together, these projects will add well over 150 million barrels of fresh capacity in just a year. That is close to what China added during the entire previous 5-year period combined. Long-term targets go even further. Policy planners have discussed reserve levels equal to at least 90 days of net imports, which matches international emergency standards. But China is not stopping there. Some estimates suggest the final system could approach 6 months of import coverage, which would push total storage toward the range of 1.5 to 2 billion barrels. For comparison, the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, built during the Cold War after the 1970s oil crises, currently holds around 370 to 400 million barrels, depending on market releases, and it took more than 30 years to reach that level. China is moving towards several times that amount, and it is doing so in less than 10 years. The speed of construction reflects how this project operates. These facilities are not isolated builds. They follow standardized designs, use domestic engineering firms, and rely on centralized financing from state banks. Once a site receives approval, excavation, lining, sealing, and pipeline connections move forward in parallel. Some of these caverns stretch more than half a kilometer in length. Others form networks of parallel tunnels stacked at different depths, each one holding crude under controlled pressure. Above ground, many of these locations look almost empty, with only small service buildings and pipeline terminals visible. But below the surface, they function like underground oil cities. So the scale is massive, the speed is unusual, but the next question is obvious. Why go underground at all? Why not just build more steel tanks along the coast, like most countries do? That decision comes down to safety, cost, land use, and long-term storage performance. And that's where the engineering becomes just as important as the strategy. At first, storing oil inside mountains sounds risky. Oil is flammable, heavy, and sensitive to temperature and pressure. So why would anyone place it deep underground instead of in large steel tanks where it is easier to inspect and maintain? The answer is that underground rock, when engineered correctly, can act as one of the safest storage containers available. These storage sites start with detailed geological surveys. Engineers look for stable rock formations with low fracture risk and minimal groundwater movement. Once they identify a suitable location, they drill access shafts and begin cutting long horizontal caverns using controlled blasting and heavy tunneling equipment. Each cavern forms a sealed chamber hundreds of meters below the surface. Before oil ever enters the system, the walls receive thick concrete linings and waterproof barriers. Then water is introduced above the oil layer to create pressure that pushes inward, keeping oil from escaping into cracks in the surrounding rock. This method is known as water-sealed cavern storage, and it has been used for decades in countries like Sweden, Japan, and South Korea. China adopted the same approach, but at a much larger scale. Inside these caverns, oil does not sit in open air. It stays under stable temperature conditions, protected from storms, fires, and surface accidents. That makes underground sites far less vulnerable to explosions, aircraft crashes, or missile strikes compared to exposed tank farms. Cost also plays a major role. Once excavation is complete, underground caverns cost less to operate than surface tanks. There is no need for constant repainting, corrosion protection, or massive fire suppression systems spread across open fields. Some estimates show that long-term operating costs can fall by nearly half compared to traditional storage terminals. Land use matters too. A surface tank farm holding tens of millions of barrels can cover entire industrial districts. Underground facilities, by contrast, require only small surface footprints for pumps and access shafts. That allows China to place storage closer to ports, refineries, and pipeline junctions without competing with urban development. And then there is durability. Many of these caverns are designed for service lives of 50 years or more. Once built, they can cycle oil in and out for decades with minimal structural upgrades. From a national planning perspective, that turns each cavern complex into a long-term asset rather than a temporary solution. So underground storage gives China three major advantages at the same time: better protection, lower operating costs, and efficient land use. But storing oil safely is only part of the story. What really drives this project is how that oil can be used during crises and how it changes China's position in global energy politics. Because once you control reserves at this scale, you don't just protect yourself. You also gain leverage in markets that affect every country on Earth. Oil does not just power vehicles and factories. It also shapes military planning, foreign policy, and economic stability. Countries that lose access to fuel lose the ability to move goods, support industries, and operate armed forces. That reality explains why large oil reserves have always played a role in national defense strategies. Large reserves also affect how China interacts with global oil markets. When prices fall, China can absorb surplus supply by filling its caverns. That added demand helps stabilize prices and supports exporting countries. When prices rise sharply, China can slow purchases and draw from storage instead, reducing pressure on domestic consumers and industries. In effect, China becomes both a shock absorber and a price influencer. This matters because China already represents one of the largest sources of global oil demand. Small changes in its buying behavior can shift market trends, shipping flows, and production decisions in exporting countries. And then there is the political side of where the oil comes from. In recent years, China has increased purchases from suppliers facing Western sanctions, including Russia and Iran. Those sales allow China to fill reserves at discounted prices while providing steady revenue to partners that have fewer export options. This strengthens long-term political ties and builds energy relationships that operate outside Western-dominated trading systems. So the storage system supports more than just domestic stability. It also supports a wider foreign policy strategy that blends trade, diplomacy, and security. However, building underground oil caverns on this scale is not cheap. Each storage base requires years of excavation, concrete lining, sealing systems, pumping stations, pipelines, and port connections. A single large underground site can cost hundreds of millions of dollars before it ever holds a single barrel of oil. The scale of this project shows how seriously China treats energy security. Few countries commit this much money, land, and engineering effort to something designed mainly for worst-case scenarios. So what do you think? Is this just smart preparation, or is China expecting rougher years ahead for global energy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.